October 28, 1941. A cold, piercing wind blows through the ravine near the village of Barbish, not far from the city of Kuibyshev. The mud under the wheels of the trucks is mixed with the first snow, creating a slippery, squelching mass that seems to try to hold the vehicles back, to prevent them from accomplishing what they came here for. In the back of one of the trucks, among a group of emaciated, silent people, is a man whose name recently thundered across the entire country, whose portraits adorned the front pages of central newspapers, and whose chest gleamed with 2 gold stars of the hero of the Soviet Union. But now he wears no awards. His clothes are tattered, and he can barely stand. His legs, broken in aviation accidents and crippled during interrogations, refuse to serve him. He is carried out on a stretcher. This is Yakov Smushkevich. The legendary General Douglas. The man who taught Stalin's falcons to fly, crushed Goering's aces in the skies of Spain, and put the samurai in their place at Khalkhin Gol. Now, in the eyes of the system he faithfully served, he is an enemy, a spy, and a traitor. The paradox of the situation reaches its climax. While German tanks are rushing towards Moscow, the Soviet government in the deep rear is preparing to take the life of the person who best knew how to stop the Luftwaffe. The sound of the truck's engine drowns out the rustle of the wind, but it cannot drown out the heavy thoughts of how quickly the peak of glory can be replaced by a firing squad ditch. The story of this man's fall began long before the verdict, which officially never even existed, was pronounced. To understand the tragedy of that October day, one must rewind the tape of time, back to an era when the air was permeated with the smell of aviation fuel and the premonition of a great war. The Soviet Union of the 30s lived by the sky. Aviation was not just a branch of the armed forces, it was a new religion, a showcase of socialism, proof that the Bolsheviks could conquer not only the land, but also the Fifth Ocean. And Yakov Smushkevich was one of the high priests of this religion. His ascent was as rapid as the takeoff of a fighter jet. The son of a simple tailor from a Lithuanian shtetl, he possessed that rare combination of fanaticism, organizational talent, and personal courage that was the only currency in that turbulent time. He did not graduate from academies in the traditional sense. His universities were the Civil War and party work. But when the party issued the call, "Komsomolets, to the airplane," Smushkevich took it literally. He learned to fly with the same obsession with which he had previously engaged in underground work. It quickly became clear that the sky was his element. But not just as a pilot, but as a strategist capable of seeing the entire picture of air combat. It was these qualities that made him an ideal candidate for a secret mission when, on the other side of Europe, in Spain, the flames of civil war erupted. Spain became the first layer of this complex historical pie. It was an external, visible conflict where ideologies clashed in direct combat. The Soviet Union officially did not participate in the war, but its volunteers played a decisive role there. Smushkevich arrived in Madrid under the pseudonym General Douglas. This name very soon became a legend on both sides of the front. For the Republicans, he was a savior, organizing the air defense of Madrid practically from nothing. For the German Condor Legion and Italian aviation, he was a most dangerous opponent, a tactical genius who broke conventional air combat patterns. General Douglas wasn't hiding in a bunker. He personally took planes into the sky, tested new tactics, and risked himself alongside lieutenants. It was there, in the Spanish sky, that Smushkevich realized the time of romantic duels was over. The era of mass aerial armies, radio communication, and large group interactions was dawning. He saw how German Messerschmitts were improving from battle to battle and understood that Soviet I-16s, the famous Ishachki, would soon face tough times. His reports to Moscow were full of alarm and concrete proposals. Stalin valued this. Douglas returned a hero. The first gold star adorned his chest, and his influence in the People's Commissariat of Defense skyrocketed. It seemed he was invincible. But fate was preparing a new, even larger turn. May 1939, the Far East, the Khalkhin Gol River. The Japanese Imperial Army decided to test the strength of Soviet borders. What began as a border incident rapidly escalated into a full-scale, undeclared war. In the first days of the conflict, Soviet aviation suffered a crushing defeat. Japanese pilots, with vast experience in the war in China, easily dealt with Soviet pilots who operated by rote. Moscow was furious. Immediate intervention was required, and Stalin again summoned Smushkevich. His arrival at Khalkhin Gol marked a turning point. He brought not only a group of the best aces who had served in Spain, but also, more importantly, a new philosophy of war. Smushkevich rigidly, sometimes brutally, reorganized the entire command system. He forced pilots to learn, analyze mistakes, and abandoned outdated instructions. He introduced the use of radio communication, group battles, and interaction with ground forces. Under his leadership, the sky over Mongolia, which had previously belonged to the Japanese, began to turn red. It was a battle of technology and will. Smushkevich personally planned operations where hundreds of aircraft converged in grandiose fire and metal flower beds. Interaction with Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the ground forces, was complex but effective. Two strong characters, two tough leaders. They understood that not just careers, but lives were at stake. The victory at Khalkhin Gol was triumphant. Japanese aviation was practically destroyed in this region. Smushkevich became a twice hero of the Soviet Union. His authority reached its zenith. He became chief of the Air Force of the entire Red Army. It seemed only the sky was higher, but it is at this height that the air becomes thin and breathing becomes difficult. Here begins the second layer of conflict, internal, hidden from public view, but far more dangerous. Smushkevich's fame had a downside. In the corridors of the Kremlin and the Lubyanka, not only his victories were whispered about. His origin, his connections, his independence of judgment began to irritate. In a system where loyalty was valued above competence, the figure of an independent, intelligent Jew at the top of the military hierarchy aroused suspicion. The era of spy mania was beginning, and Smushkevich's biography, full of foreign assignments and secret missions, provided fertile ground for the fantasies of NKVD investigators. His involvement in backroom diplomacy became particularly dangerous. Rumors circulated about his contacts with international circles, which were interpreted by the distorted consciousness of the Chekists as a Zionist conspiracy. In reality, Smushkevich, as an intelligent man, understood that the world was moving towards catastrophe and sought any means to strengthen the country's defense capabilities. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the late 1930s, any unauthorized contact was interpreted as treason. Moreover, the hero's physical condition was deteriorating. An old accident, when he nearly died during a flight, made itself known. Fractured legs, multiple surgeries, he often moved with a cane, overcoming hellish pain. But he did not allow himself weakness. He knew that if he stumbled, the pack that applauded him yesterday would tear him to pieces. This internal fear, hidden deep beneath the mask of an iron general, gnawed at him from within. He saw his comrades, other heroes of Spain, disappear and understood that his turn might come too. The third layer of conflict, ideological and technological, manifested itself in all its glory during the Soviet-Finnish War. The Winter War of 1939–40 was a cold shower for the Red Army and for Smushkevich personally. The mighty Soviet aviation, seemingly capable of wiping tiny Finland off the face of the earth, got bogged down in snows and fogs. The lack of prepared airfields, the inability to fly in difficult weather conditions, problems with ski landing gear, all this was revealed overnight. Smushkevich rushed across the fronts, trying to organize work, but the system was unwieldy. He saw that Soviet aircraft, excellent for maneuverable combat in the warm skies of Spain, proved helpless in the harsh conditions of the north. Moreover, intelligence reported new German developments, compared to which Soviet I-16 aircraft looked like yesterday's news. Smushkevich tried to convey the bitter truth to Stalin. "We are lagging behind. We need new engines, new alloys, new sights. We need radio communication for every aircraft." But the leader did not like bad news. Not systemic errors, but sabotage began to be blamed for the failures of the Winter War. It was at this moment that the very conspiracy of aviators began to form, which would become fatal for the entire top brass of the Air Force. Stalin, disappointed by the results of the Finnish campaign and alarmed by the successes of the Luftwaffe in Europe, decided that the problem was not in industry or deadlines, but in people, in those who allegedly deliberately hindered the development of Soviet aviation. The shadow of suspicion fell on Smushkevich. His attempts to explain technical difficulties were perceived as sabotage, and his warnings that war with Germany was inevitable and that we were not ready for it sounded discordant with official propaganda after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The transformation of the situation happened rapidly. In 1940, Smushkevich was removed from the post of head of the Air Force and transferred to the position of Inspector General. This was a demotion, but not yet a sentence. It was a Chinese warning. However, the flywheel of repression had already been set in motion. Files with denunciations accumulated on investigators' desks. Japanese spy. This label, absurd for a man who defeated the Japanese, became the main vector of accusation. The logic of the NKVD was twisted but ironclad. Since you were in the East for so long, since you won, it means you could have made a deal. It means your victory is just a cover for introducing an agent even higher. To this were added accusations of creating an anti-Soviet military organization. Under torture, Smushkevich's previously arrested colleagues began to testify against him. They signed any papers just to stop the torment. Thus, the myth of a gigantic conspiracy in the leadership of the Air Force was formed, the purpose of which was allegedly to weaken the air power of the USSR in the face of the enemy. The irony of fate was that it was Smushkevich who did everything possible to strengthen this power. In the spring of 1941, the tension reached its limit. German reconnaissance aircraft regularly violated the USSR border. Smushkevich demanded permission to shoot them down, but received an categorical refusal. Do not succumb to provocations. He saw how planes stood wing to wing at airfields, presenting ideal targets. He wrote memoranda, called, demanded. His persistence began to be perceived as panic-mongering. On June 8, 1941, just 2 weeks before the start of the Great Patriotic War, Yakov Smushkevich was arrested. He was taken directly from the hospital where he was recovering after another operation on his legs. It was an act of incredible cynicism. The hero, who was physically unable to resist, was dragged out of his ward. He was charged under Article 58, treason, terrorism, participation in an anti-Soviet organization. The investigation was conducted with incredible cruelty. The investigators knew they were dealing with a man of iron will and sought to break him as quickly as possible. They beat his injured legs, deprived him of sleep, and threatened his family. The interrogation protocols from that time are terrifying documents, recording the process of destroying a personality. Smushkevich was forced to confess that he was simultaneously working for British, Japanese, and German intelligence. This utter nonsense was meant to explain to Stalin why Soviet aviation was unprepared for war. And then, the war began. On June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe delivered the very blow Smushkevich had predicted. Hundreds of Soviet planes were burned right on the airfields. Those that managed to take off often lacked communication and a clear plan of action. The chaos of the war's first days became the best proof of Smushkevich's correctness, but for him, it was a death sentence. Stalin needed scapegoats. The aviation defeat was blamed on the activities of Smushkevich's treacherous group, Rychagov, and other repressed generals. They were accused of having prepared the defeat through their sabotage. Smushkevich and other high-ranking prisoners were evacuated from Moscow to Kuibyshev. The front was approaching the capital, and the especially important state criminals were decided to be moved to the rear. The journey was long and agonizing. In crowded and stuffy prison cars, yesterday's elite rode towards their end. Smushkevich likely understood that there was no hope. But even in these moments, he was most likely thinking not of himself, but of what was happening in the sky above the front. He knew the shortcomings of the I-16. He knew how dangerous the Messerschmitts were. He knew the price young lieutenants were now paying for the political leadership's mistakes. And so we return to that cold October day in the village of Barbish. The execution order was signed by Beria without any trial, just a list of names. The procedure was simplified to the extreme. No last words, no lawyer, only the reading of the decree and the command. Along with Smushkevich, 19 other people were executed that day. Among them were other outstanding aviators, creators of the Soviet defense shield. Lieutenant General Rychagov, very young, also a hero of the Soviet Union. General Stern, another hero of Khalkhin Gol and Spain. Designers, engineers, the flower of the nation, destroyed by its own country at a moment of greatest danger. The execution scene was devoid of any pathos. It was dirty, routine work for the executioners. Smushkevich, who could not stand, was supported or laid on the ground. A volley rang out. The bodies fell into a pre-dug pit. They were covered with earth, trying to hide the traces of the crime. Thus ended the life of General Douglas, a man who could have become a marshal of victory, but became a victim of paranoia and the system's cruelty. But physical death was not the end of the story. For many years, Smushkevich's name was erased from memory. His books were removed from libraries, his face retouched in photographs. Relatives lived with the stigma of being enemies of the people. His wife and daughter went through camps and exiles. Only after Stalin's death did the rehabilitation process begin. Slowly, with a creak, the truth began to emerge. In 1954, Yakov Smushkevich was fully rehabilitated due to the absence of a crime. His ranks and awards were returned to him, posthumously. The resonance of this tragedy is still felt today. The story of Yakov Smushkevich is not just the biography of one man. It is a terrible lesson in how a totalitarian system devours its most devoted and talented children. It is a story about the price of incompetent authority trying to cover up its mistakes with the blood of the innocent. The destruction of the top brass of the Air Force on the eve of the war became one of the main causes of the catastrophic losses of 41st year. If people like Smushkevich, Stern, Rычagov had been alive and commanded aviation at the beginning of the war, history might have taken a different path. Millions of lives could have been saved. Today, looking at old photographs where Smushkevich smiles, standing by the wing of an aircraft, we do not see a spy or a traitor. We see a man who sincerely believed in a bright future, who gave his all to serve the motherland. His fate is a reminder that patriotism and professionalism are no protection against arbitrariness if the state ceases to value human life. The lessons of Barbish are relevant even today. The search for internal enemies, spy mania, distrust of professionals. This is a dead-end path, a path to defeat. Concluding this story, we mentally return to that truck driving away from the ravine. The silence that fell upon the execution site seems deafening. The wind sweeps away tire tracks with snow. Nature is indifferent to human tragedies. But memory is what counteracts oblivion. Yakov Smushkevich remained in the sky. In every roar of an aircraft engine, in every masterful maneuver of a pilot, there is a particle of his legacy. General Douglas did not disappear. He dissolved into the history of his country, becoming its tragic but integral part, an eternal reproach to conscience and a symbol of indomitable courage in the face not only of an external enemy, but also of monstrous injustice. Many decades have passed. The execution site in Barbish is now Yuri Gagarin Park. Children play where the blood of heroes once flowed. Life goes on, conquering death. But somewhere deep in the alleys, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of those distant shots, reminding us of the high price paid for our right to live under a peaceful sky. And as long as we remember the name of Yakov Smushkevich, as long as we remember General Douglas, his last flight continues, endless and eternal, like the sky itself which he loved so much. Thus, Smushkevich's life path closes in a circle, from a small-town tailor to the pinnacle of military power and back again, to a nameless pit near Kuibyshev. But within this circle lies the entire essence of the era: greatness and baseness, heroism and betrayal, rise and fall. This is a story that cannot be rewritten, but which must be known to understand who we are and where we came from. Yakov Vladimirovich Smushkevich, twice hero, general, a man from whom victory was stolen, but whose honor could not be stolen. There are no chapters in this narrative because life is not divided into chapters. It flows continuously, from one event to another, intertwining destinies and circumstances into a single pattern. And in this pattern, the thread of Yakov Smushkevich's fate shines especially brightly, despite the brutal and unjust attempts to sever it. His contribution to the development of aviation is the foundation upon which the great victory of 1945 was ultimately built. And though he did not live to see that May Day, his invisible presence was there, in the sky over Berlin, along with Soviet fighters, whose wings carried the genetic code instilled by General Douglas. Understanding the scale of Smushkevich's personality comes through realizing the tasks he solved. He didn't just teach how to fly, he taught how to think in the air. He transformed chaotic biplane dogfights into organized air operations. He was a technocrat in a country of ideologues, and this contradiction proved fatal for him. His pursuit of truth, of a realistic assessment of the combat capabilities of equipment, collided with a wall of wishful thinking presented as reality. This conflict between a professional and a bureaucrat embodies an eternal plot, repeating itself century after century. When we speak of Stalin's falcons, we must remember the one who put these falcons on the wing. Smushkevich was the architect of Soviet air power. His legacy is not only tactical schemes and organizational structures, it is the spirit of offensive, aggressive, intelligent aerial warfare. Even while in prison, according to cellmates' testimonies, he continued to analyze the initial failures of the war, sketching diagrams on the prison floor, trying to convey advice on how to rectify the situation to those outside. Until his last breath, he remained a soldier. The tragedy of Smushkevich also lies in the fact that he was an ideal Soviet man. He believed in communism, was devoted to the party, and could not imagine himself outside the system. He was not a dissident. He was part of the flesh and blood of this regime. And all the more terrifying appears his destruction by this same regime. It is akin to an autoimmune disease, where the body begins to attack its healthy cells, mistaking them for viruses. The Soviet Union in the 1930s was sick with this fear, and Smushkevich became one of the most prominent victims of this illness. Rumors of his Zionism and connections with the global backstage were not just the ravings of investigators. This was a reflection of a deep distrust of a man who transcended the narrow national and ideological world. In Spain, Smushkevich saw the world, saw a different life, communicated with people of different cultures. For a closed Stalinist society, such a person became an outsider, incomprehensible, and therefore dangerous. His broad perspectives, his European fame, worked against him. In a world where everything must be gray and uniform, a bright personality is always under scrutiny. Today, historians are painstakingly piecing together the details of those days. Archives are opening. Interrogation protocols are being published. We learn how courageously Yakov Vladimirovich held up, how he tried to save his subordinates by taking the blame upon himself. We see how he refused to slander those who were still free. This requires incredible strength of spirit, especially when you know you are doomed. Every year on October 28th, aviation enthusiasts and historians visit the memorial sign at the execution site. They bring flowers, they stand in silence. In this silence lies respect for his feat and sorrow for the loss. But most importantly, it is memory. Memory that true heroes do not die as long as they are remembered. Yakov Smushkevich has returned from oblivion. He is back in the ranks. Streets are named after him, books are written about him, films are made. Justice, though with enormous delay, has triumphed. But this justice has a bitter taste. The bitterness that the life of a unique man was cut short in his prime, and we will never know what other heights he could have achieved. History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but in Smushkevich's case, it is difficult to resist the question, what if? What if Stalin had believed him, and not the whispers of envious people? What if the Air Force reforms had been completed before the war? Perhaps 41 would not have been so tragic. Perhaps the blockade of Leningrad would not have lasted so long. Perhaps... The answers to these questions have been carried away by the winds of history. We are left only with facts, documents, and human memory. And the image of a man on crutches led to execution for loving his homeland too well. At the end of this long journey through time and destinies, only one feeling remains, a feeling of deep gratitude. Gratitude to a man who showed an example of true service to a cause, an example of courage and professional honor. Yakov Smushkevich is a beacon whose light penetrates the fog of decades, pointing the way to new generations of aviators and patriots. And as long as this light burns, as long as our memory lives, the story of General Douglas is not over. It continues in every new ascent, in every peaceful dawn, in every heartbeat of those who remember.